For nearly all of human history, food was dying the moment it was harvested. A fish pulled from the river began to rot within hours, milk curdled by midday. Meat left untreated in summer became dangerous before the sun had set. We lived for thousands of years in an unbroken negotiation with decay. A negotiation we could never win permanently, only delay. And yet, across medieval Europe, populations numbering in the tens of millions fed themselves through winters that lasted 5 months, through famines that wiped out harvests, through sieges that sealed cities shut for years. They did this not with any single invention, but with a vast, intricate architecture of preservation techniques so effective that many of them survived virtually unchanged into the 20th century. The question is not whether medieval people could preserve food. The question is how they built an entire civilization on methods we have almost entirely forgotten. To understand the ingenuity of medieval preservation, we must first understand the world it operated within, a world in which hunger was not a metaphor but a permanent companion. The medieval European peasant lived on a caloric knife edge. A typical family in 13th century England worked between 10 and 30 acres of land, depending on their status, producing a mixture of wheat, barley, oats, rye, and legumes. They kept small numbers of livestock, a cow, perhaps a few pigs, or a handful of chickens. Gardens yielded cabbages, onions, turnips, peas, and herbs. It was, by modern standards, a remarkably narrow diet, and almost every calorie of it was seasonal. Fresh vegetables were available for perhaps 4 months of the year. Grain could be stored if properly dried, but it was vulnerable to moisture, rats, and weevil. Meat was a luxury timed almost entirely to the killing season. The rhythm of the agricultural year was dictated not by preference but by biology. That cattle and pigs required feed through winter, hay, stubble, acorns, whatever could be gathered, and most peasant households simply could not sustain large herds through the cold months. The arithmetic was brutal. Every animal kept alive through January was an animal eating food that humans might need by March, so the medieval calendar revolved around a single, decisive event that shaped the entire food economy of Northern Europe. Martinmas, the 11th of November. This was the Great Autumn Slaughter, the day, or more accurately, the week, when communities across England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia killed the animals they could not afford to winter. Pigs especially, fattened on autumn acorns in the forest through a practice called pannage, were slaughtered in enormous numbers. The Domesday Book of 1086 measured woodland, not in acres but in the number of pigs it could support. So central was this cycle to the economy. Like what happened next, in the hours and days after Martinmas, determined whether a family ate adequately until spring or starved by February. The race against rot had begun. The first and most ancient weapon was salt. Salt was not merely a seasoning in the medieval world. It was a strategic commodity, a currency, a cause of wars. The Latin word salarium, from which we derive salary, referred originally to the allowance Roman soldiers received to purchase salt, a detail that reveals how fundamental this mineral was to the preservation of life itself. By the 13th century, salt production was one of the largest industries in Europe. Coastal regions from Brittany to the Baltic operated vast salt pans where seawater was evaporated in shallow pools. Inland, salt mines like those at Salzburg, literally salt fortress. And Wieliczka in Poland employed thousands of workers and generated revenues that funded entire principalities. The chemistry was simple but powerful. Salt draws moisture from organic tissue through osmosis, creating an environment too dry and too chemically hostile for most bacteria. A peasant preserving pork after Martinmas would rub coarse salt into every surface of the meat, pack it tightly into barrels or stone troughs, and add more salt between each layer. The process, known as dry salting, could preserve meat for 6 months or longer. Fish, especially herring and cod, were salted on an industrial scale. By the 14th century, the Hanseatic League had built a trading empire stretching from Novgorod to London, largely on the back of salted herring. A single Hanseatic ship could carry tens of thousands of salted fish packed in barrels of Baltic brine. But salt was expensive. And thus a bushel of salt in 14th century England could cost the equivalent of several days' wages for a laborer. Poorer families used it sparingly, relying instead on a second technique that required no purchased materials at all: smoke. Smoking preserved food through a combination of dehydration, chemical coating, and antibacterial compounds present in wood smoke, principally formaldehyde and acetic acid. Nearly every medieval peasant dwelling in northern Europe contained a smoke hole or rudimentary chimney, and many were designed so that meat and fish could be hung directly in the rafters above the central hearth. The constant low smoke that filled these houses, a feature that modern visitors would find nearly unbearable, served a dual purpose. It kept insects away from stored food and slowly cured whatever hung above the fire. Hams, sausages, and fish could be smoked for weeks, producing a dried, darkened product that remained edible for months. In regions with strong smoking traditions, Scandinavia, northern Germany, Scotland, specialized smokehouses were common even at the village level. The type of wood mattered enormously. Oak and beech produced a dense, reliable smoke. Juniper and alder gave distinctive flavors that became regional signatures. The choice was not arbitrary. It was accumulated knowledge passed across generations. Yet smoking and salting shared a limitation. They worked superbly for meat and fish, but they could not preserve the other great pillar of the medieval diet: dairy, vegetables, and grain-based foods. For these, medieval communities turned to a technique that was, in a sense, the opposite of fighting decay. They embraced it. Fermentation, the controlled decomposition of food by beneficial microorganisms, was arguably the most sophisticated preservation method available to the medieval world, and certainly the most misunderstood by modern audiences. We tend to think of fermentation as a craft, a hobby. For medieval Europeans, it was survival infrastructure. Consider cheese. Fresh milk, available in abundance from April through September, was worthless within days if left untreated. But by introducing rennet, an enzyme harvested from the stomachs of young calves, and allowing bacterial cultures to transform the milk solids, a peasant household could convert a gallon of perishable liquid into a dense, calorie-rich block that lasted through winter. Monastery records from the 12th century describe cheese cellars holding hundreds of wheels aged for months, each one representing preserved summer sunlight in edible form. The great abbey of Cluny in Burgundy distributed cheese rations to its monks year-round, cataloging varieties by age, texture, and origin with a precision that rivaled their scriptoria. And beer and ale operated on the same principle. Water in medieval towns was often unsafe. Grain was abundant after harvest, but difficult to store without spoilage. Brewing solved both problems simultaneously. The boiling process killed waterborne pathogens. The fermentation created alcohol, which acted as a preservative, and the resulting drink provided calories, hydration, and essential B vitamins in a stable, storable form. In 14th century England, per capita ale consumption has been estimated at roughly 1 gallon per day for adult men and women. A figure that sounds extraordinary until we recognize that this was not recreation. It was nutrition. Vegetables, too, were fermented. Cabbages were shredded and packed with salt into barrels, producing sauerkraut, a preparation documented in European sources from at least the 13th century, though likely far older. Turnips, beets, and beans were treated similarly. The lactic acid produced during fermentation dropped the pH low enough to prevent the growth of harmful bacteria, effectively pickling the vegetables in their own juice. No vinegar was required, no heat, just salt, thyme, and the invisible labor of lactobacillus. Vinegar itself, the product of a secondary fermentation in which alcohol is converted to acetic acid, provided yet another preservation medium. Fruits, vegetables, eggs, and even meat could be submerged in vinegar and stored in sealed crocks for months. Pickled herring, a staple of Lenten diets across Catholic Europe, was consumed in quantities that are difficult to comprehend by modern standards. A single monastic household might consume hundreds of pickled fish during the 40 days of Lent alone. Beneath all of these chemical methods lay one final elemental strategy: cold. Medieval Europeans could not manufacture cold, but they could harvest it. Our root cellars, underground chambers dug into hillsides or beneath houses, maintained temperatures between 7 and 12 degrees Celsius year-round, cool enough to slow bacterial growth dramatically. In northern climates, ice and snow were packed into insulated pits during winter and covered with straw and earth. These ice houses, documented in monastic records from the 9th century onward, could preserve ice well into summer. The wealthy used them to store fresh meat, butter, and cream. But even modest households benefited from the simple physics of underground storage. A barrel of salted pork kept in a cool cellar lasted significantly longer than one stored at surface level. The timing of the agricultural calendar reinforced this. The Great Slaughter happened in November, precisely because the cold weather had arrived. Meat processed in the first weeks of winter benefited from near-freezing temperatures during its initial curing phase. By the time spring warmth returned, the salt and smoke had done their work. The entire system, biological, chemical, architectural, was synchronized to the rhythm of the seasons in a way that left almost nothing to chance. What emerged from these techniques was not merely a set of survival strategies. It was a food culture of extraordinary depth and resilience. The medieval peasant who packed salt pork into a barrel, hung sausages in the rafters, sealed cheese into a cellar, and brewed ale from autumn barley was not performing isolated tasks. Each act was part of an integrated system, a system in which every surplus calorie from the warm months was captured, transformed, and banked against the inevitable deficit of winter. The knowledge required was immense: when to slaughter, how much salt to use, which wood to burn, how long to age the cheese, when the ale was ready. None of it was written down in peasant households. All of it was transmitted by practice. Observation and memory passed from parent to child across centuries. But the system had its costs. Salt taxes, the notorious gabelle in France, were among the most hated and regressive levies in medieval Europe, precisely because salt was not optional. It was survival. Governments understood this and exploited it ruthlessly. The French gabelle, formalized in 1341, required every household to purchase a minimum quantity of salt from royal warehouses at fixed prices. Smuggling salt became a capital offense. Entire regions revolted over salt taxation, and the resentment it generated fed directly into the social pressures that would eventually fracture the feudal order. Meanwhile, the feast and famine cycle imposed by seasonal preservation shaped not just diets, but bodies. Nutritional analysis of medieval skeletal remains reveals patterns of periodic stress, lines in tooth enamel, and a thinning of bone density that correspond to the late winter months when preserved stores ran lowest. The gap between Martinmas abundance and March scarcity was not theoretical. It was written in the bones of the people who lived through it. And yet, for all its precariousness, the system worked. It sustained populations through the medieval warm period and the cooling centuries that followed. It fed the construction of cathedrals, the waging of crusades, the expansion of trade networks that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Every stone laid at Chartres, every ship that sailed from Venice, every scholar who debated at Oxford was fueled, ultimately, by food that had been salted, smoked, fermented, or buried in cold earth months before it was eaten. We live now in a world of refrigeration, of nitrogen-flushed packaging, of supply chains that deliver fresh strawberries in December. We have solved the problem of decay so thoroughly that we have forgotten it was ever a problem at all. But for the vast majority of our history, the central question of human existence was not how to grow food. It was how to keep it. The answers our ancestors devised are still with us. In the cheese we age, the wine we cellar, the ham we cure, the pickles we jar. We call them traditions now, delicacies, artisanal crafts. For the people who